A fortress in Afghanistan. 1 month after 9/11. Two operatives from the CIA's Elite Special Activities Division are hot on the trail of Osama bin Laden.
Those first teams were going into the wildest Wild West.
This is the declassified story of how the CIA with elite special forces put down a Taliban uprising, outnumbered 100 to 1.
It's like a scene from Armageddon.
We hear from the people on the ground as it happened and reveal their footage from the heat of the battle.
What's happening? There's a prison uprising.
Caught in the crossfire, the CIA makes a discovery for which one operative pays the ultimate price. America is under attack. Acting on orders from Osama bin Laden, teams of hijackers fly aircraft into New York's World Trade Center. Two more planes are hijacked. One hits the Pentagon. The other crashes before it reaches its Washington target. In under an hour, nearly 3,000 people are dead. It's the worst terrorist atrocity in US history. The nation is in shock.
The United States had been caught so off guard by the September 11 attacks, it just seemed inconceivable that two gigantic towers and in the nation's capital could come under attack by this ragtag group of terrorists from across the world. It was not hard to conceive that there were other attacks underway.
President Bush speaks to the nation and to the world.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
The full operational force of the CIA now focuses on one man and his network of terrorists.
Finding bin Laden was a priority from the outset. The head of the Counterterrorism Center for the CIA talked about bringing home bin Laden's head on a pike.
The world turned upside down on 9/11. I mean, the next day it was anything you want from Congress, from everywhere, anything you want, request whatever you want. And we took whole branches from other parts of the agency and expanded rapidly by a factor of like 7.
Well, Osama bin Laden, from the beginning, was going to be a difficult target to go after. He was a practiced clandestine operator.
The CIA knows bin Laden is hiding in Afghanistan. He's found refuge with the Taliban, the ruling extremist Islamic regime. But they don't know his precise location. Even so, very quickly, they develop a plan. Intelligence-driven warfare. For the very first time in American history, President Bush approves a plan using the CIA as a lead element in a war. Operation Enduring Freedom is the invasion of Afghanistan. The aim? To overthrow the Taliban regime and flush out Osama bin Laden. In a matter of just weeks, the Taliban are in a full-scale retreat. Thousands are captured by America's allies, the Afghan Northern Alliance. On the ground from the very beginning are highly trained covert CIA operatives. They've been sent in to interrogate captives and gain information on exactly where bin Laden is hiding. Just 10 weeks into the war, CIA analysts learn of an opportunity. A chance for their men to interrogate individuals who could potentially lead them to their #1 target. 85 miles outside the northern Afghan town of Kunduz, Taliban fighters have assembled on the road to Mazar-e-Sharif. Their leaders want to negotiate a truce.
Now, these guys were fully armed. They had with them AK-47s, PKM light machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades. They had all the normal armaments that the Taliban and al-Qaeda had.
These men are not just Afghans. There are also hundreds of foreign fighters.
Now, what kind of fighters are drawn to an international jihad from overseas? They are, by their very nature, the most extreme, because to do that you have to have some kind of extreme commitment to come and fight in a foreign land.
At the CIA headquarters, analysts receive intelligence that many of these hardline foreigners are in fact members of al-Qaeda. Some may be high-ranking commanders. Some may even know where bin Laden is hiding. The CIA decides to send in specialist interrogators. So they turn to an exceptional unit, the CIA's experts in operating in hostile zones, the Special Activities Division. Outside the city of Mazar-e-Sharif, a two-man Special Activities Division team prepares for their mission. Dave Tyson is a Central Asian specialist. He is a fluent speaker of Dari, the language of America's ally, the Northern Alliance. With him, Johnny Michael Spann, Mike, a 32-year-old former Marine from Alabama. He's been with the CIA for 3 years. This is his first field assignment.
So those first teams that were going into the wildest Wild West that you can imagine. If they got into a firefight with the Taliban, there was no cavalry going to come in. They were on their own at the tippiest tip of the spear of American power.
The team's mission? To persuade the surrendering fighters to reveal precisely where bin Laden is hiding. At the same time, just a few miles away, the foreign fighters are taken to Kalajangi, a sprawling, mud-walled 19th century fort in the desert a few hours west of the city of Mazar-e-Sharif. The fort is 600 meters across, with massive walls 20 meters thick and 30 meters high. Inside are 2 enclosed compounds, separated by a dividing wall. To the north is the Northern Alliance headquarters building. To the south, the so-called Pink House. And nearby lies the armory. Despite its size, there is still nowhere truly suitable to house such a huge influx of men.
You need a large building, large enough to hold and process and house and feed 600 men, and you need somewhere which you can secure them in. They didn't have any prisons, obviously. What alternatives were there?
Northern Alliance guards have little choice but to herd the Taliban into the basement of the Pink House, the building in the middle of the compound. This will be their makeshift prison. But the foreign Taliban become restless. After the truce, they had expected to be able to walk free. To these hardline jihadis, imprisonment comes as a shock. Their frustrations wouldn't matter but for one thing. Their Northern Alliance guards have failed to confiscate all the prisoners' weapons and grenades.
In Afghan tradition, and in Muslim culture as well, if somebody says they are surrendering, you are supposed to take that at face value. This is supposed to be an honourable thing. So in the old tradition, they weren't searched, they were processed into the fort very quickly, and a lot of these guys had weapons hidden under their clothing.
They're still armed and dangerous, as one Taliban fighter quickly shows.
I don't know the mentality of those Taliban fighters, but I guess it's an attitude of, okay, I surrender, I make myself defenseless, but maybe not utterly defenseless. Shall I keep something just in case? And that's probably when one of them, or some of them, decided to use the grenades that they had hidden.
The explosion is the last action of one Taliban fighter's life. A warning of what the Taliban are capable. As a result, inside that underground prison, the fighters develop a plan. They outnumber their Northern Alliance guards by 5 to 1. They know that just across the compound, there is an armory. It is packed with rockets, RPGs, machine guns, and mortars. They decide if they are not released the following morning, they will take matters into their own hands. They'll execute a full-scale breakout. If they do, the CIA's 2 covert agents will be caught in the middle. The 2 undercover agents, Mike Spann and Dave Tyson, arrive at the Kalajangi fort to begin the interrogations.
For them, the fighters were a source of intelligence. Let's get as much as possible intelligence from them and information. This was about 2.5 months after 9/11. And I think this of course, put the military and especially the CIA under an enormous stress and pressure to deliver the information, the intelligence.
Spann and Tyson need information to lead them to bin Laden, or intelligence on the next planned al-Qaeda attack.
It was, the jobs of these interrogators to a large extent to figure out, well, what were these plans? What was coming next? And there was intense pressure on them to get answers to these questions because there was not going to be another way to get those answers.
But the fort is far from an ideal setup for questioning. The CIA interrogation manual sets clear guidelines on how to cross-examine a detainee. Interrogators should have time to memorize a detainee's history, to present files, dossiers, and photographs. They should have time to repeat their questioning, or to lure the prisoner into making the first move. Most of all, they should be able to keep the prisoner separate from other captives. In the open-air compound of the Afghan fort, playing it by the book just isn't possible. The fort is filled with hundreds of Taliban, guarded only by a handful of America's Northern Alliance allies. If anything goes wrong, they are on their own. The question is, do they go ahead with the interrogations? Or do they abandon their mission and pull out? It's a huge risk, but one they feel they must take. They adapt to the situation and improvise a plan.
First thing you need to do when you're trying to gather intelligence and you've got 600 prisoners is work out which ones know nothing, which ones might know something, and which guys are the real gems in terms of intelligence. So that first morning, they were processing the prisoners through this filter, if you like. Mike Spann was leading the questioning. So he was the guy doing the face-to-face with the prisoners. Dave Tyson was stood back with an AK-47, kind of watching over things. And then you had a few Northern Alliance soldiers on the battlements or at the entrance to the prison, bringing the prisoners out. But there was very few Northern Alliance guys around, so the security was very light.
After 2 hours, they notice one particular captive. He is unusually pale-skinned and is wearing items of Western clothing. They suspect he speaks English. They realize this could be the one man they can communicate with directly. The one man they can break. But the prisoner refuses to talk. Spann and Tyson have to move on, but not before the prisoner's image is sent back to the CIA's Langley headquarters and cross-referenced with known al-Qaeda operatives on the CIA database. But identifying him will take time. He may be what they term a clean skin, an extremist not yet known to the CIA. So for now, Spann and Tyson are in the dark. In the basement prison, the hardline Taliban fighters realize what's going on. They will not succumb to interrogation.
I'm convinced the Taliban, they were not prepared to be questioned by Americans and not by the CIA.
Bear in mind, you've now got 600 of the hardest, most extreme prisoners in Afghanistan at that time, face-to-face with, as they see it, the enemy. And not just any old American enemy. These guys who are questioning them, they know they are special forces or CIA. These are the cream of America's warriors. These are the people of anyone that they most want to kill. And so you can imagine how explosive this confrontation is.
The Taliban decide the next group to be brought out to the compound will trigger a breakout. On the other side of the fort, a German journalist and his cameraman are in the northern compound headquarters building, waiting for permission to interview the prisoners.
Smoking a cigarette, waiting, birds singing, wonderful blue sky, cool, fresh air. A very peaceful setting. And then all of a sudden there were 1 or 2 explosions, grenades.
A Taliban prisoner detonates his grenade in a suicide attack.
Almost immediately after that, heavy small arms fire started. It was obvious this is not just a couple of shots being exchanged. This is a real heavy gunfight. And then I grabbed my sat phone and ran for cover in the main building, which was like 20 yards away from where I had been at the time.
CIA operatives Spann and Tyson now realize they are facing a full-scale breakout.
Spann then had a decision to make. Marines do not take a back step. They go forward. They go forward in the face of the enemy.
Within seconds, Mike Spann is faced with a wave of attacking Taliban. Ambushed and outnumbered.
He could have run. He could have run and saved himself, but he didn't. He stepped forward and he decided to make a stand.
Just yards away, Spann's colleague Dave Tyson is powerless to help his friend. He has no choice but to make a break for it, towards the headquarters building. Tyson's arrival is captured on camera by the German TV crew and relayed around the world. This is actual footage of the event. His undercover status is immediately blown. Instinctively, Stout suspects Tyson is CIA.
I mean, to have an armed civilian American dressed like an Afghan on the ground meant something in the field of Secret Service.
Where are you from? Are you American?
He is very controlled, but you see he's very upset and nervous at the same time. And from, his appearance, I had the very clear impression that he had witnessed something horrible. I asked him, what is going on? This was my very simple question. And he said, there's an uprising of the prisoners.
What's happening? There's a prison uprising. Yeah. How do they have got weapons? They stole them from
Tyson's mission is clearly compromised. He has to think of a way of keeping the operation alive. But he is on his own, and his weapons are empty. By now, the Taliban prisoners in the basement of the Pink House have killed their Northern Alliance guards. They ransack the armory.
And at that stage, you had 600 guys armed with AK-47s, mortars, RPGs, PKM light machine guns.
Northern Alliance allies take up defensive positions and mount a counterattack, trying to keep the Taliban at bay. It's a vicious firefight. From the shelter of the headquarters building, CIA agent Dave Tyson can hear the battle escalate. Unless he can control the situation, the mission to extract vital information from the prisoners will fail. And an opportunity to track down Osama bin Laden will be lost. Agent Tyson uses journalist Stout's phone to call for backup. But he has a problem. He has no contact number for the US Special Forces Quick Reaction Force stationed locally. He has to improvise.
At the time, I didn't know, but later I checked the numbers from our sat phone. It was the number of the American embassy at Tashkent, Uzbekistan. That's where he called.
From the fort just outside Mazar-e-Sharif, Tyson calls a number he believes is his only option. The embassy in Tashkent patches Tyson through to the US Army Central Command at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. MacDill route him to the Special Forces local command base at Mazar-e-Sharif. By the time his emergency call reaches a fellow CIA paramilitary officer at base, it has traveled 20,000 miles. Tyson gives a full situation report. This is the actual recording of what he said.
We control the north end of the fort. The south end of the fort is in their hands. There's hundreds of dead here, at least. And I don't know how many Americans are here. We just need help to free this place up.
Tyson warns that any intervention must be precise. There is hand-to-hand fighting. Enemy and allies in close proximity.
And he made it very clear, he repeated it like 3 times, saying, you can't come and bomb the place.
Can't hit it from the air.
Because friends and foes were so close to each other that they might have killed us by bombing.
On the other side of the fort, the heavily armed Taliban have identified the building in which Tyson and Stout are sheltering. They pound it with mortar shells.
It must have been, I think, a mortar grenade exploding just above the ceiling, which made an enormous impact in terms of acoustics. It was so loud, and my ear went.
In response, America's allies, the Northern Alliance, drive an old Russian tank onto the northern ramparts and bombard the enemy. Caught in the middle of the battle, all Tyson and Stout can do is hunker down and wait for help. Just 2 hours after the first shot is fired, that help arrives. The quick reaction force of US and British special forces that Tyson had requested.
I think it's the Brits who turn up first. In a Land Rover, wearing Barber jackets and jeans, and they're all called things like Scruff and Ginge. It's hilarious. And they're moaning. The driver is moaning. He's saying, oh, there's nowhere to park. You know, meanwhile, there's back. You know, and I was taking all this out. It's just fantastic, sort of, you know, the elite of Britain's army, you know, moaning while they sort of casually go about sort of organising this battle. And then the Americans turn up as well, and there's more of them. There's about 8 of them, and they're much more aggressive. Let's do this, let's do that. The first thing they do when they arrive is they send someone up to put eyes on, as in have a peek over and work out what the hell's going on. What are we facing? How many people? How are they armed?
The team's commander assesses the situation. He has just 15 men. His Northern Alliance allies number around 50. The enemy has 600. Despite this, the quick reaction force goes in and takes on their enemy.
It's like a scene from Armageddon. You've got tracer rounds going to the sky, you've got RPGs firing off. This has kicked off into a major firefight. And at the moment, you've just got a few Northern Alliance soldiers there trying to put down the uprising. It is a hopeless situation.
Very quickly, the Special Forces realize they're not going to be able to crush the uprising on their own. They will need to adapt.
The special skill that the Special Forces have is that they are able to handle it, and that they're able to go in with the plan, and when that becomes impossible, they're able to make another one quite quickly. And that's the edge that they have.
Okay, let's go.
Despite the fact that friend and foe are fighting in extremely close quarters, the Special Forces team makes the decision to bomb the Taliban from the air.
The one advantage, apart from their training and their superlative abilities, the one advantage they can very often rely on is air power. Because air power evens up the odds somewhat. You can have a few guys behind enemy lines, but if they can call in airstrikes, they can have the effect of hundreds. Get the airstrikes in, get the enemy's head down. It's the shock factor as much as anything else that puts the enemy's heads down for a few seconds. There's always a danger when you call in airstrikes that, you know, the pilot will get it wrong and drop the ordnance on you. And in any case, in this situation, they were dropping danger close. They were dropping within a fraction of what the safe distances are. But there was nothing, I mean, what else could you do? So the risk of getting hit by their own munitions, the risk of friendly fire was significant, yeah. But, I mean, they had no option, they had no choice.
A Special Forces spotter team provides precise GPS coordinates for a bomber pilot circling overhead.
4646. This is 10. We're in position. Over.
They shine a range-finding laser, or SOFLAM, on the pink house, where the Taliban are taking shelter. Above them, an F-18 Hornet is armed with guided 500-pound JDAMs, weapons designed to be accurate to within just 12 yards.
Copy that. Here they come.
One bomb after another rips through the southern end of the fort.
You hear this sound like a car that's in high gear, sort of decelerated, it's going woo, like that. And you can see this thing. It just pops out of the clouds like a javelin, coming, looks like it's coming straight at you, and then sort of, it's obviously off to the side. Boom. And everything jumps. The building that we're on jumps. And you black out for sort of, I don't know, half a second or so, and you sort of come to, you know, it's like you're rebooting or something.
The Taliban retreat past the bodies of at least 100 of their fellow fighters. The respite is only temporary, but it gives the Special Forces the opportunity they need to send in a search team to find missing-in-action CIA agent Mike Spann.
It's a US Navy SEAL maxim, you never leave a man behind. And it's a British military maxim that you never leave your buddies behind. There is no other decision to be made. We will go in.
After hours of looking and under heavy fire, the two-man rescue team reaches the southern compound. There, the spotter's search comes to an end.
He scans the southern end of the fort. I guess he wants to see him, but he doesn't want to see him. It's a horrendous situation to be in. And eventually he sees a guy lying on the ground, and he can see he's wearing blue jeans and a kind of shirt, which is exactly what, you know, CIA SAD operatives would wear.
The search team confirms they found the body of Agent Mike Spann. He is the first American casualty in the war on terror. Under fire, it's simply too dangerous to retrieve his body.
They can go no further. And so in what must have been the worst moment of the man's life, I would imagine, well, for both of them, they have to make the decision to turn around and leave a fellow soldier in the hands of the enemy.
They vow to return for him. On the other side of the fort, CIA agent Tyson doesn't yet know the fate of his colleague. He and reporter Arnim Stout are trapped on the roof of the headquarters building. Tyson knows, before nightfall, he must find a safer place from which to plan a strategy for somehow resuming interrogations. Crossing the roof risks them being picked off by a Taliban sniper. Even then, there seems to be no way down. But a Northern Alliance fighter reveals a possible route to safety.
There was one wounded Afghan. He had 2 or 3 gun wounds. Not very serious ones, but on his crutches, you know, he crossed the roof, someone helped him, and he slid down the wall and he disappeared.
Using his CIA training, Tyson calculates the risks. They must time their run between incoming bullets.
Hey guys, time to go.
Huh?
It's time to go.
I remember at one point Tyson just saying, "It's time to go," in a very decisive way. And that was the signal for everybody. And then one after the other, we crossed that roof. We slid down the wall. We ran towards that clay road, and there was a van there. You know, like out of nothing, there was a van as if we had ordered a cab, you know?
Stout is driven through the desert to safety. Tyson can regroup at the CIA's local base. The fate of his mission to locate Osama bin Laden now lies in the hands of the Special Forces and the success of their airstrikes. In the basement of the Pink House, the Taliban face their second night in the fort. Some 300 of their original 600 fighters lie dead. Everyone is convinced that with America's overwhelming firepower, the battle will be over by morning. But no one has foreseen the determination of the Taliban prisoners to fight to the death.
Setting up comms right now, over.
On the third day, further teams of US Special Forces arrive to assist the CIA's operation, together with reinforcements from the Afghan Northern Alliance. Inside the Pink House, there is no sign of surrender. So the air bombardments continue, despite the CIA's concerns that friend and foe are simply too close. But this time the bombs used won't be a standard 500-pound JDAM. This time, they're 4 times as big. The coordinates are dictated and confirmed.
0, 6.
And a countdown is given.
1, 2, 9er. Hey, Mr. B, they're about ready to drop. Pull back at this time.
Journalist Alex Perry joins the Special Forces teams, calling in the strikes.
Boom! You know, you hear it, woo, that. Boom! I mean, it shoots, 300 yards into the sky. Biggest thing we've ever seen. This is suddenly a 2,000-pounder, I learned. It puts a swimming pool-sized hole in the wall.
The dust towers 1,000 feet high. But the bomb hasn't hit the intended target.
And we're thinking, that's where we were, that's where all those guys are, that's where the Americans are, they've just hit their own people.
A 2,000-pound American bomb has wiped out a Northern Alliance tank position. Up to 30 Alliance men have been killed. 5 US and 2 UK Special Forces men are badly injured. It's just as the CIA had warned. Friend and foe are too close together for airstrikes.
And you can just see all these guys coming out, just they're grey with dust, pink eyes, and half of them are completely deaf. And we're just thinking, how many people died?
Day after day, the battle rages on.
Several days went by when you had like massive bombardments or big gun battles or, maybe 200 guys on a parapet firing down this thing. Nothing could possibly survive. And you go back the next day and it's the same situation and you're back to square one and it starts again.
Taliban deaths are in the hundreds. Still, many fight on. Others regroup in the basement of the Pink House. Will any be left for the CIA to interrogate?
And if you look down on this quadrant, there were hundreds of bodies. And you're like, well, how, it looks to me like everybody's dead. And you could tell that there was almost no one firing back. Maybe one, maybe two. So our assumption was, everybody's dead, but we were wrong.
In their Pink House refuge, the remaining Taliban are armed, defiant, and still refusing to surrender.
I think at some point it was obvious to them they would all die there.
The Afghan Northern Alliance are now in charge of the fort. But how can they flush out the remaining Taliban? They try firing into the building with guns and RPGs. They pour oil through the tiny windows and set it on fire.
This may sound brutal, OK? This may sound medieval and horrific, but bear in mind, they weren't trying to force them out to kill them. They were trying to force them out to accept their surrender.
But the Taliban don't want to surrender. Eventually, the Northern Alliance has just one remaining option: to flood the Taliban from their refuge. They divert a nearby stream directly into the Pink House basement. After 20 hours in freezing water, yet more of the hardliners perish. Somehow, 86 Taliban fighters survive. In the bitter cold of morning, they surrender.
They were starving, they had been firebombed, they had been shot at, they had been frozen with water. They were half drowning. But they came out of that basement largely to a man full of hatred and full of defiance.
To the men of the Special Forces, it is mission accomplished. But to the CIA, it's only the beginning. At last, they can return to interrogate the Taliban prisoners for vital information on Osama bin Laden's hideout. The CIA have to find out if the pale-skinned Taliban Spann and Tyson had picked out 6 days earlier survives. Of the original 600 Taliban, only 86 remain. And among the survivors is the man the CIA agents have identified as of particular interest. They confirm what they had originally suspected. He speaks English. At first, he claims his name is Suleiman Al-Faris. But then he reveals he is John Walker Lind, a 20-year-old student from California.
It was a sort of miracle that this guy was alive, but he garnered attention, not least because he was an American under Taliban, and that was just such a shock after 9/11. They couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it.
Overnight, the world learns that jihadis can be of any race, any color, any nationality. Terror can be homegrown. Under interrogation, Walker Lind confirms he met Osama bin Laden once at a training camp, but can reveal no intelligence on bin Laden's current hideout. Walker Lind is charged with consorting with the enemy and is serving a 20-year sentence with no prospect of parole. The CIA's hunt for Osama bin Laden must continue. In the fort, the US Special Forces retrieved the body of CIA agent Mike Spann. It had been booby-trapped by the Taliban. A CIA officer for 3 years and father of 3. He is the first American casualty in the war on terror, buried with full honors as an American hero. As for his colleague, Agent Tyson, despite his cover being blown by the TV crew, he remains working at the CIA. In operations reports, he has been referred to variously as Dave, Dawson, and Olson. His current identity and whereabouts is known only to a few.
Yeah, we went to the compound the next day just to say hello. Did you get home safely? Are you okay? I gave him my business card. I mean, obviously, he didn't give me any.
Only now has the depth of the CIA's involvement in Operation Enduring Freedom, the invasion of Afghanistan, been revealed.
A tiny handful of Special Forces soldiers from the CIA mainly basically managed to roll back the Taliban with air power across the whole of the north of the country within a matter of weeks.
The work of the CIA's interrogators like Mike Spann and Dave Tyson in those early days provides crucial information in the pursuit of al-Qaeda and the hunt for Osama bin Laden.
This was the main source of intelligence on this organization for a period of years, was being able to sit across the table in an interrogation booth from somebody who'd been recently captured and then persuade that person to give up as much information as possible.
Information that after over a decade of dedication, in May 2011, leads the CIA to a private compound in Abbottabad in Pakistan. And to the death of America's most wanted, Osama bin Laden.
Che Guevara was a cold-blooded assassin. He had an unbelievable desire of killing people.
In the 60s, he's causing mayhem in Bolivia to spark off revolutions throughout South America that will destabilize the area and threaten American interests. He has to be stopped. So the CIA turns to top agent Felix Rodriguez.
I think it was very personal for Felix. He saw a lot of his friends die.
His mission, capture Che Guevara and bring him back alive. Now, based on recently declassified documents, we can reveal the true story of this secret CIA assignment to hunt down one of the world's most famous revolutionaries. In a remote area of the southern part of Bolivia, a unit of government soldiers are out on a routine patrol. Suddenly, out of the blue, seven are killed. 12 soldiers are taken prisoner. The Bolivian soldiers are losing an ever-widening war against one of the world's most notorious revolutionaries, Che Guevara, who is determined to spread chaos. Che knows the current Vietnam War is tearing the US apart. His aim is to create similar confrontations throughout South America to drag them into it. This, he believes, will allow communism to finally triumph.
He wanted to create 100 Vietnams for the United States so that the United States would be putting out fires. He knew that the American public had no appetite to send troops all over the world. So that was his ultimate goal, bringing down America, which he believed was this imperial threat. He hated America.
In 1961, Che wrote, "The US is the great enemy of mankind. Against those hyenas, there is no option but extermination. We will bring the war to the imperialist enemy's very home, to his places of work and recreation. The imperialist enemy must feel like a hunted animal wherever he moves. Thus, we'll destroy him." Born in Argentina, Che is a professional revolutionary communist.
He was this mysterious figure. I wouldn't say to the extent of Osama bin Laden, because there were differences. But really, the goals were the same, to bring down the United States.
He fights against the US-sponsored coup in Guatemala. He leads the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro and overthrows the US-backed government.
If you were going to be a revolutionary, you had to be a hard person. You had to be dedicated. You had to believe in what you were doing, and he truly did.
To students and revolutionary youths the world over, he is a hero, a freedom fighter.
He was young, he was handsome, he was articulate. He had this reputation.
Che believes the United States backs right-wing dictatorships, and those dictators exploit their own people. Only armed resistance, he argues, will address this imbalance.
And that's what made him really popular among the masses, or amongst college kids in the United States, that kind of idealism, that indeed we are an egalitarian society and we're going to level the playing field, so to speak. He's writing how-to books on revolution that are being used by revolutionaries all over the world and being read on college campuses in the United States. He was the picture of revolution.
But to others, Che is a cold-blooded killer.
When we think of Che, we think of him in the beret with the limpid eyes. But the real Che Guevara was gangster, murderer, killer.
And now in 1967, Che's brought his armed revolution to Bolivia.
The Bolivian government was afraid. They were getting reports from the countryside that there were men speaking a different kind of Spanish, and they had large sums of money, and they were doling it out, and they were trying to buy a huge amount of supplies. They have soldiers out on a routine patrol, and all of a sudden, they're ambushed. And it didn't happen once, it happened several times.
His successes early on terrified the Bolivians because they didn't have the military to combat it.
The Bolivian soldiers are reeling under the attacks from Che's men.
All their equipment was old World War II surplus stuff. They were in desperate need of some modern equipment, but mostly they were in desperate need of some modern training.
Desperate for assistance, the Bolivian president reached out to the US. The CIA, monitoring developments closely, is concerned that if Che's revolution in Bolivia is successful, communism could sweep through huge countries like Brazil and Argentina.
Bolivia borders 5 other South American nations, and from Bolivia, that could be the epicenter of a revolution that would spread from Bolivia all throughout South America and Central America.
If this happens, it will bring communism right into America's backyard. At first, the American response is cautious.
clearly they need help. But we didn't want American soldiers going into the field and dying, because we're already engaged in Vietnam, and we did not want that to escalate into South America, into our hemisphere.
Just 17 Green Berets have flown in. Their mission is simply to train the Bolivian soldiers. They are forbidden to fight against Che's guerrillas directly, through fear of inflaming the situation. Che was right. America really didn't want to be sucked into another big conflict.
It was a classic Green Beret mission, which is send, special forces into an area, train the locals, get them really up to speed militarily, train them in the intricacies of war and counterinsurgency, and let them do the fighting.
For the next 4 months, the US instructors, many veterans of Korea and Vietnam, train the Bolivian soldiers.
The men that come to camp are Bolivian conscripts, and most of them had maybe a 4th or 5th grade education. So now you're trying to teach basic concepts to people who don't even have basic math skills.
The military has a term for training. It's crawl, walk, and run. And when the Green Berets got to Bolivia, the Bolivian army was crawling. They did a lot of physical training because a lot of the campesinos didn't have the physical strength that they needed. So they would climb ropes, obstacle courses, and then as they got out of the crawl phase where they were able to use their weapons correctly and patrol correctly, then they got into some walking. They really had to build this Bolivian military from the bottom up in order to be at the level they needed to take on these guerrillas.
They teach them how to march, shoot, move at night, detect booby traps, fight hand to hand, and avoid ambushes.
Building aggression and building them into soldiers was a key part of the training.
So we instilled a very aggressive spirit into them. You got to be tough. You got to, once the shooting starts, don't sit down.
I'm in Bolivia, you were forced to serve. So I think you had to start the training by building that aggression and that fervor to fight the enemy.
The problem facing Washington is not only are the Bolivian army poorly trained, but intelligence on the ground is virtually non-existent.
Our intelligence network at that time wasn't great. We were so focused on the Soviet Union, we had very little intelligence on them. There was so much conflicting information, and that built into the whole myth of Che, this boogeyman. And did he have hundreds of men, thousands of men?
So the CIA calls in one of their top agents, Felix Rodriguez, to lead the hunt for Che. 26-year-old Felix is the perfect man for the job. Born in 1941, Rodriguez was a victim of Castro and Che's revolution in Cuba. He and his family were forced to flee when the communists seized power in 1959.
My uncle, who was a senator in Cuba, so he had to leave the same day to the United States in his boat. And of course, they ransacked his house. And then when I started looking at what was happening in my country, that's really what decided me to do something about it.
Felix left school to fight against Castro. He felt a motivation to go and do this. It was very important to him, and he's been fighting communism ever since.
I think it was very personal for Felix. He saw a lot of his friends die. He saw a lot of their businesses confiscated. He saw a lot of good people hurt.
The young Rodriguez develops a deep loathing for Che Guevara.
Really, he was a cold-blooded assassin. He had an unbelievable desire of killing people. He always hated the United States tremendously.
In 1967, Che wrote an address from his Bolivian jungle camp expressing that hatred. Hate, as a factor in the struggle, intransigent hatred for the enemy that takes one beyond the natural limitations of a human being and converts one into an effective, violent, selective, cold killing machine. Our soldiers must be like that. A people without hate cannot triumph over a brutal enemy. Our every action is a battle cry against imperialism and a battle hymn for the people's unity against the great enemy of mankind, the United States of America. Rodriguez is summoned to a meeting with the CIA in his hometown, Miami. He is told that his mission is to gather intelligence on the rebel force and help the Bolivians track Che down. One thing is made very clear to him. His job is to bring Che Guevara back, alive.
Felix was recruited because he had a long history of working with the CIA at that point. He had been part of the advanced teams that went into the Bay of Pigs, and then he had also worked on some other operations to try to overthrow Castro. So he was well known in the Cuban exile community and was well known by the CIA and had worked for them in the past. And he was a prime candidate mostly because of how eager he was to take part in a mission like this.
For Felix, the thought of going down there and possibly capturing Che, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was his chance to give back to the United States and to right what he felt was a wrong to his country.
Rodriguez goes to Washington and moves into a safe house to prepare for the top-secret mission.
It's standard operating procedure for the CIA to use safe houses in Washington. And the reason for that, obviously, was they didn't want people knowing about his mission.
Rodriguez is then given what little intelligence the CIA has on Che. Some personal documents and photographs found in Che's abandoned Bolivian camp, and statements from captured guerrillas and deserters of the rebel force.
It is very important to be able to familiarize yourself with as much as you can with the guerrilla. You want to know exactly how they feel, the way they operate, and that's important when something happens in the field.
As the days go by, Rodriguez slowly builds a picture of the rebel force. He learns that there are approximately 40 to 60 guerrillas operating in a 75-mile-wide corridor, stretching for over 200 miles in a remote wilderness area in southeastern Bolivia. They are well-trained, confident rebel soldiers. Despite the Green Berets' training, the Bolivian soldiers are no match for the guerrillas.
The captured documents that they found were key because they were the first thread that Felix was able to then pull on to try to track the trail.
In the course of his preparation, Rodriguez starts to focus on one particular rebel, a man named Paco.
Paco was a Bolivian who thought he was going to Cuba to study. Instead, his uncle takes him to Che's camp and says, "You're not going to Cuba. You're fighting for the Bolivian Revolution." And he said, "What Bolivian Revolution?"
Felix identified him as one of his key targets because it was easy to figure out his motivation. And I think a lot of times intelligence officers are looking for the people who have a reason to talk. And I think Paco's reason to talk was pretty simple. He was an unhappy guerrilla.
Rodriguez now develops a plan. If he can find Paco, he can potentially turn him and gain information that would lead them to Che. Special intelligence agent Felix Rodriguez secretly enters Bolivia. His cover, a businessman named Felix Ramos. The hunt for Che Guevara is finally beginning. But the clock is ticking. From March through to July 1967, Che and his guerrillas strike the Bolivian soldiers at will with devastating effect.
They were overmatched by these Cubans who had really honed their craft not only on the Cuban Revolution, but also later in the Congo and some other places.
Then Rodriguez hears news that Bolivian soldiers are searching land thought to be inhabited by Che's guerrillas.
At first, when the Bolivians made a sweep of the property, they found some of the material they left behind, including, pots on the oven that still had food in them. But one of the people there tells them, look, if you go back there are these hidden caves.
2 weeks after Rodriguez arrives in Bolivia, government soldiers make a spectacular discovery. Che's storage caves. They contain a treasure trove of information on the rebel force.
Felix was able to convince the Bolivians that it was a good thing to take evidence, not to burn it.
Back in his local CIA station in the Bolivian city of Santa Cruz, Rodriguez is presented with the guerrillas' documentation of their contacts in the country, deciphered radio messages from Cuba, and travel information with false names and photographs of the rebels.
One of the things that Felix understood about counterinsurgency is that revolutionaries like to keep journals and make notes. And what he was able to do was exploit these papers, because the exploitation of intelligence, when you pick it up from a guerrilla camp or a cave or off the body of a dead guerrilla, it can prove hugely valuable.
One of the documents taken from the guerrillas' cave is Che's passport. It reveals how he entered Bolivia disguised as a middle-aged Uruguayan economist in November 1966. Rodriguez spends hours combing through every wallet, photograph, notebook, and scrap of paper recovered from the abandoned guerrilla cave.
Che was a prolific writer, so he loved to write, and he was very disciplined. He kept all of his details of the operation and all the contacts and all the notebooks in caves.
Every day, Che carefully records the events of his guerrilla campaign in his personal diary. His captured writings provide Rodriguez with a valuable insight on how and where Che's guerrillas operate, who his colleagues and collaborators are, and what Che is thinking. From a military point of view, we had 3 new battles with losses for the army but none for us. The morale of the guerrilla movement is growing stronger, and if handled well, will certainly guarantee success.
Che chose Bolivia because it was a central part of South America. And what his hope was to start the revolution there and then be able to spread it out into the rest of South America.
They believe that if you have a small group of men who are really dedicated and they start the revolution in a rural area, they can recruit the peasants, and that would spread throughout the countryside and eventually make its way to the cities. And then they would take over.
Che's writings reveal plans to create a major uprising using the Bolivian peasants. But as he reads on, Rodriguez discovers Che's strategy isn't working. The locals are not joining them. The peasant base has not yet been developed, although through planned terror we can neutralize some of them. Not one enlistment has been obtained. Rodriguez realizes that Che has wildly miscalculated. He has focused his operation in the wrong part of the country. Che should have chosen the area around Bolivia's capital city, La Paz.
There are really 2 Bolivias. There's the Bolivia that's really active around La Paz, and you have tin and copper mines, and you have unions that are there, and you have the university system and students. That would have been ripe for revolution. But Che, for some reason, he picked this area of Bolivia that was remote, that was scrubland. He picked an area where the peasants, the poor farmers, spoke a different language. They really didn't speak Spanish. And so when he came into the area, they were very suspicious of outsiders. People were just looking to eke out a living. They were just looking to survive. They had no idea what revolution was.
This is critical news for Rodriguez. He now realizes there is weakness. Che's rebel force is not as large as originally suspected. Then Rodriguez's detective work uncovers another clue to Che's operational plans. The guerrillas' account books. They show that all the funds for Che's revolution passed through one person's hands in Bolivia's capital city, La Paz. The problem is, they have a photograph, but no name. Rodriguez realizes if he can track her down, he can cut Che off from all his funds and communication. But who is she? Then, a critical piece of intelligence comes through to Rodriguez's CIA station in Santa Cruz. In a remote area of the country, a local farmer reports that he's spoken to some guerrillas. They had turned up and asked him where they could safely wade across a swollen river to get some supplies.
The guerrillas had no support from the people because they attempted to contract with a farmer who was going to give them a safe way to cross the river. So they were using the locals to help, while the locals sold them out to the Bolivians.
The Bolivian army now set a trap. They tell the farmer to put a white curtain on a tree to let the guerrillas know where it is safe to cross. During the early hours of the morning, Bolivian soldiers stake out the area. From his base in Santa Cruz, Rodriguez urgently calls the Bolivian commander and tells him that it's vitally important that any prisoners taken are kept alive so he can interrogate them.
Felix understood that you don't get intelligence by killing people. You get intelligence by making them your friends and eliciting information from them, and he was very good at that.
The Bolivian soldiers wait all day for Che's guerrillas to show up. Then, as evening approaches, the guerrillas, guided by the farmer, begin to wade across the river at the agreed spot. As they reach midstream, the Bolivian soldiers open fire. Seven of Che's guerrillas are killed.
At the end of the battle, they were able to pull two survivors, two men who were wounded.
One is executed. The other is identified as Paco, the man Rodriguez believes could be the key to getting to Che. Rodriguez receives the news of Paco's capture. His worry is that the Bolivian soldiers will shoot him before he can interrogate him.
That's why I interceded and told him this prisoner was very important to us. If you believe that the information we got from him is not worthwhile, I will never ask you for another prisoner. But please give this guy to us. And he did.
Felix went to get him and flew him out and made this youngster realize that he was not going to be killed. And the relief must have been overwhelming because the other guerrillas were dead.
He was wounded in 2 places. Not lethal, but he was wounded in here, and in this place here, in these 2 places here. So I did pay for a nurse from a hospital to come over and to treat him. And we were able to save his life.
Back in his base in Santa Cruz, Rodriguez can now begin the most important part of his mission. He can interrogate the person who he thinks could lead him to Che. At first, Rodriguez plays the nice guy.
He gives them clothes, he lets them, buys them magazines, he allows them to write letters home. And on the flip side, he starts building rapport with them just by talking to them.
Little by little, Rodriguez gets Paco to open up.
I could tell that the guy had a tremendous memory. He would cite the location where he was months before, and he could give you the address and the name of 15 people. And that's very unusual.
After 2 weeks of interrogation, Rodriguez realizes the great revolutionary Che is in even more trouble than he thought.
From Paco, he was able to find out that this was a very fractured unit. There was a lot of infighting. There was no harmony. This was a dysfunctional revolutionary band.
They didn't have enough food. They weren't able to scrounge from the people because the people weren't supporting them. What it did is it degraded his force to the point where they were really combat ineffective.
A lot of the Bolivians wanted to desert and go back to their families. The Cubans were hardcore, and they said, no, you're not going to desert. And the Cubans basically took over.
Thanks to Paco's information, Rodriguez now realizes that Che's guerrillas are on the point of collapse.
And he realized there weren't hundreds of soldiers out there. There was this small unit, they were a ragtag unit, and really, it wasn't whether we're going to beat them, it's we need to get Che.
Rodriguez then decides to show Paco the photograph of the mysterious person who controls Che's funding and communication network.
So I brought these pictures to Paco, and Paco was the one who identified Loyola Guzman and told us this is La Coyola Guzman, who is from the university.
Loyola Guzman, 25, a graduate of the elite Communist Party activists' training school in Moscow, a member of the Bolivian Communist Youth. She is Che's key contact and financial organizer, working out of a secret cell in Bolivia's capital city, La Paz. This is a huge breakthrough for Rodriguez. He calls in the Bolivian soldiers to arrest her, but she refuses to talk, saying she would rather kill herself than betray her comrades. Despite her silence, CIA agent Rodriguez has won a victory. By capturing Guzman, he has cut Che off from his funds and communication. Rodriguez has them exactly where he wants them. The rebel force is now completely isolated and on their own. All the CIA need to do is initiate an operation to finally bring Che to his knees. But Rodriguez still doesn't know where Che is. Then there's another breakthrough. Bolivian soldiers fire on a small band of guerrillas. 3 are killed.
The 3 men are brought in on the back of mules.
If Rodriguez can identify any of the dead men from his long study of this rebel force, he might have a clue to Che's whereabouts. Rodriguez finds a driving license and documents. The names he knows are bound to be false, but they do contain photographs. Back at his CIA office in Santa Cruz, Rodriguez compares these documents to the information he's collected in his files. He is able to identify the three guerrillas. One, called Miguel, is captain of Che's front column.
One thing that Felix was a good detective. He was a good investigator. So at this point in the campaign, he knew every member of Che's group. He knew how they moved.
Che divided his column into three sections, with groups of men traveling in the front, middle, and rear guard.
Che split his force into three that would march in certain intervals so that you would never caught all of them together.
Rodriguez knows that Che always moves in the protected middle column, just 1,000 meters behind his front men. Using the location of where Miguel is killed, Rodriguez is able to determine Che's position. This is the breakthrough he's been waiting for. It is the critical moment. He now knows where Che is. He's got to strike immediately. Rodriguez urgently calls the US Green Berets Command to release the Bolivian 2nd Rangers Battalion from training and send them in to combat Che.
I said, we are convinced that Che Guevara is in the area.
At first, there was pushback. They said, they're still training. They haven't even had their graduation ceremonies yet. How are we going to send them out there?
Felix argues that this is the last bit of training. This is the parade and the hand-holding of the medals, and it's not as important as what they know already.
I said, we have to move the battalion right now. We want to get him.
Rodriguez eventually gets his way. The Bolivian battalion are dispatched immediately to hunt Che down. Rodriguez receives information from the Bolivian command that there is a band of 17 guerrillas holed up in a ravine, somewhere deep in the Bolivian countryside.
The area that they were working in was a very rough, mountainous area. It was not like dense jungle the insurgent can hide very well in.
The Bolivian army starts to move in.
Che was really trapped in this valley, and by now the Ranger Battalion was in the area hunting him down, using the techniques, the training they received from the Green Berets.
Che and his guerrillas discover they are now completely encircled by the Bolivian troops.
It is the key moment in the campaign. Tactically, it's perfect. It's exactly what they were trained to do, which is they set up a blocking position on the high ground, and then they sweep through the canyon, trying to flush Che out.
They continued pursuit, and that's what they did. They ran these guys into the ground, literally.
As the guerrillas try to escape, the soldiers, all recent graduates of the US Army Special Forces training camp, pick them off. Che's rebel force is now locked in a heated battle, and the tide is turning in the favor of the Bolivian army. One guerrilla is putting up a fierce fight. A bullet strikes him in the leg and he collapses on the rocks. As the soldiers ask him to identify himself, he shouts, "Don't shoot me. I am Che Guevara, and worth more to you alive than dead." The wounded Che is brought back to a small hamlet. He is kept under guard in a schoolhouse until the Bolivians decide what to do with him. The news reaches CIA agent Felix Rodriguez in his station in Santa Cruz.
When Che was captured and we heard the news, you know, it was a tremendous feeling.
Rodriguez now flies in to where Che is being held. The first thing he does is photograph all of Che's captured documents.
And that's important because when Che surrenders, he has this knapsack, and it has his diaries, because Che is a prolific writer, and every day he would sit down and write another diary entry telling all about the campaign. And Felix Rodriguez recognizes immediately just how important this is. He's going to start taking pictures of the diary for the CIA so they can process it.
These pages document in detail Che's 11-month military operation in Bolivia and his revolutionary thoughts. It will help to inform the CIA on how communist-backed guerrillas plan and cement their armed revolutions. But then Rodriguez learns something alarming. The Bolivian officers holding Che are threatening to execute him. This is directly against Rodriguez's orders to keep him alive so the CIA can interrogate him.
Felix's mission there, though, is really to try to save Che's life, because the CIA at that point had told him before he left, we want this guy alive. If you can get Che alive, get him alive.
Rodriguez now appeals to the Bolivian military's top brass to halt the execution. The answer comes in a coded call, sealing Che's fate.
We had a very simple code: 500 Che Guevara, 600 dead, 700 alive.
Rodriguez is given the code 500 for Che, 600 for dead. Che is to be executed.
Felix was conflicted because on one hand, he had his orders from the CIA to keep Che alive. And now he was receiving orders straight from the Bolivians saying Che was going to be executed. And so at first he thought, well, how can I get, how can we plan his escape? How can I get him out of here and smuggle him back?
I reflected on it, and I thought could have tried to save his life. At the same time, and I felt there was a responsibility I wasn't about to take. I believe that letting history run itself was the best thing that could have happened. So at that point in time, I thought there's not much I can do anymore.
Rodriguez enters the schoolhouse to give Che the news. These two men have been playing a lethal game of cat and mouse. And now, the final confrontation.
Che would talk to no one. He would not be talked to, but he talked to Felix. And the question has always been why. And to me, the answer is that Felix treated him like a man.
I looked at him and said, "Commander, I'm sorry. I tried my best." He perfectly understood what I was saying. He turned white like a piece of paper. But he said, "It's better this way, as you have never been captured alive." And then he changed the expression and said, "And if you can, tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy." That was the last word.
What is interesting about his face-to-face confrontation with Che Guevara is exactly how against type it was. This is a man who he considered scum of the earth, who he considered a murderer, a sociopath, and yet he treated him with great compassion. He treated him as an equal.
We looked at each other, he approached me, we shook hands, and we embraced.
Rodriguez asks if he can take a picture of the two of them side by side. Che agrees.
I gave my camera to the pilot, and I stood next to him, and some soldiers next to us put my hand around him and said, "Commander, look at the little bird." And he laughed. It's a Cuban saying, "Mira el pajarito," when you tell that to kids, look at the little bird. Actually, when I gave the film to the CIA, I told them there's a picture of Che with me laughing. Of course, when he saw the picture was going to be taken, he changed the expression.
This is the last picture taken of Che alive. Now the moment has come to carry out the orders from the Bolivian High Command. Rodriguez briefs Che's executioner, a Bolivian soldier who has volunteered to shoot Guevara. Executing Che without a trial is illegal, so Rodriguez orders the soldier to make it look like he has died in battle.
Don't shoot from here up, shoot from here down, because this man's supposed to die from combat wound.
39-year-old Che Guevara then says his last words. I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man. So ends the life of one of the most famous revolutionaries of all time. The man who set out to overthrow US-backed governments and destroy America lies dead.
Che Guevara was a charismatic, provocateur, revolutionary, gangster, murderer who's hugely unsuccessful in Bolivia. And I think he met the fate he deserved.
Che's body is flown to a local town where he is laid out for public display. It's a message to everyone. Revolutionary terrorism will not triumph. Back in Washington, the CIA views this as the perfect operation. They've been stalking Che for over 10 years and have now finally ended his reign of terror.
For the Americans, I think it was some relief. He had been a ghost for so long, they had tracked him for so long, and they knew that he was such the heart of this exporting of the Cuban-style revolution. To be able to have him gone and not be able to start a revolution in there was I think, greeted well.
High on the list of CIA successes is the way Rodriguez broke new ground in Bolivia with his pioneering investigative techniques.
I think that his insistence on keeping Paco alive, I think the way he exploited intelligence, I think the way he elicited information, the way he dealt with the Bolivians on a one-to-one basis made it possible for them to do the capture that they did. Felix's mission in Bolivia was to help track down Che Guevara. The way he went about it was revolutionary. And I think it set the course for counterinsurgency in the ensuing decades.
It was a blueprint for everything that's done right and continues to be done right to this day. A lot of the techniques are still being used, especially in Afghanistan.
6 weeks after Che's capture, Rodriguez was back in South America training an elite Ecuadorian intelligence unit in the anti-terrorism techniques he had perfected in Bolivia. Argentina, El Salvador, and Lebanon followed. In 1969, the man who caught Che Guevara became an American citizen and enlisted in the United States Army. During the Vietnam War, he flew over 300 helicopter missions and was shot down 5 times. He received 9 crosses for gallantry by the South Vietnamese government. And during his career with the CIA, Rodriguez was awarded the Intelligence Star for actions of extraordinary heroism. But despite all this, Rodriguez will always be remembered for his CIA mission to hunt down Che.
You know, I was 26 years at the time, 26-year-old. I have done a lot of other things that I consider probably more important, but for one reason or another, this is the one who have become more famous because of the figure of Che Guevara.
March 2011. Libyan rebels rise against Muammar Gaddafi. What at first appears to be a spontaneous uprising is in reality the culmination of a carefully managed, top-secret, 30-year-old CIA operation.
The goal here is to get rid of Gaddafi, to overthrow him.
For decades, America has been plotting to remove the man it branded the Mad Dog of the Middle East.
Gaddafi was a chief sponsor of terrorism.
They wanted him out. They wanted to make an example of him.
Because there's evil in this world, and the evil's got to be dealt with.
What few people know as the rebellion against Gaddafi unfolds is that the man leading the uprising is in fact a long-time CIA contact.
Kahlifa Haftar and his lieutenants were trained by the CIA to remove Gaddafi.
There's a bunch of Libyans, you give them arms, say, all right, go, get rid of Gaddafi.
His relationship with the CIA dates back to the 1980s.
He returned to Libya 20 years later to finish a job that was left undone.
Recent investigations reveal that the Libyan rebels are directed and coordinated by CIA experts on the ground. This is the top-secret account of the true extent to which the CIA was instrumental in the Libyan revolution, which took down Gaddafi. CIA headquarters, Langley, Virginia. The North Africa desk is buzzing. They are monitoring secret communications coming in from Libya.
Satellites and electronic surveillance can be collecting huge amounts of communications between any sort of threat to the United States.
The first 387 messages are innocuous. But when they reach the 388th, everything changes. It appears to be a direct threat.
I got intercepts that were clear-cut. It wasn't a question. No one could argue with them.
The intercepted message reads, "Stand by and be ready to attack American targets and execute the plan." The CIA immediately considers it to be an imminent and credible danger. The message emanates from the intelligence headquarters of one of America's most dangerous enemies, Muammar Gaddafi. Since leading a coup to overthrow King Idris in 1969, Muammar Gaddafi has been a tyrannical dictator of Libya.
He'd taken over in 1969 as a very young colonel, and he'd managed to institute a system, if you like, of divide and rule. He made sure that the army high command never grew too strong. He never really had a rival.
Originally, the West had thought they might be able to deal with Gaddafi.
I think there was hope that the U.S. could work with him. And, that rather quickly went away.
Having quelled dissent in Libya, Gaddafi soon embarked on a campaign of murdering Libyan opponents abroad.
He had spies everywhere, both at home and abroad. He very much kept a watch on the exile movement, such as it was.
He wants to get rid of these opponents who have left Libya. And he sends assassination squads to Europe and hires people in the United States to kill members of the opposition.
He had his hit teams out knocking off Libyan, I think he called them stray dogs.
He allows dozens of terrorist groups to run training camps in Libya.
Well, it's often said that he was, the key controller of terrorism or terrorist groups, certainly in the Middle East and maybe to some extent Africa.
Muammar Gaddafi gives money and weapons and passports and safe haven to a number of terrorist groups.
The CIA have long suspected he is actively targeting America.
Gaddafi was seen as the bogeyman because of his sponsorship of terrorism.
They didn't like Gaddafi, you know. They looked at him almost as sort of a, ideological menace.
The CIA know that Gaddafi is behind terrorist acts around the world, including the slaughter of American and Israeli civilians by Palestinian gunmen at Vienna and Rome airports in 1985.
He was a significant enemy to the United States.
For most of my time in CIA, he was a problem one way or the other.
But what makes Gaddafi truly terrifying is his unpredictability.
This mad dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world Muslim fundamentalist revolution.
President Reagan, of course, famously called him that mad dog because Gaddafi's behavior was so irrational at times.
He was sort of a lunatic.
The man at times seemed to be unstable, but on the other hand, he was obviously clever, and he played things very well.
Now it seems that the Mad Dog is ordering a direct attack on American targets. The question is, who are the targets and where are they? Later that day, Libyan intelligence officers contact their agents abroad. The message is intercepted by a CIA listening post.
The Americans had managed to basically tap into pretty much all Libyan communications with their diplomatic premises abroad. The Libyans were not nearly as careful about covering their traces as, say, the Syrians or the Iraqis. So the Americans knew that something was afoot.
The CIA discover the location for the attack: Germany.
The communication had been with East Berlin, and the People's Bureau in East Berlin had tipped Tripoli off.
The message from the Libyan embassy in Berlin reads, "Tripoli will be happy when you see the headlines tomorrow." The CIA now have a date and a rough location, but little time to try to stop the attack. The CIA station in Berlin is put on full alert. All they know is that someone, somewhere in the city, is preparing an attack on an American target. Agents are ordered to contact all informants to gather any intelligence about the impending attack. But as the hours pass, their investigations yield little actionable intelligence. In the early hours, at the La Belle nightclub, a spot popular with American GIs, revelers are enjoying their night out. Nobody notices a woman entering the club carrying a bag. Then, in Langley, another message is intercepted. Again, it originates from the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, sent at 1:30 a.m.
The Libyans did that just minutes before this bomb attack took place.
The message simply says, "Happening now."
There's been yet another major terrorist incident, this time in Berlin. A bomb ripped through a nightclub frequented by Americans.
230 people are injured in the blast. 3 will die: a young Turkish woman and 2 US soldiers.
The bombing of the disco in Berlin was a fairly seminal event in that Americans died.
For the first time, the CIA have cast iron evidence that Gaddafi is behind an atrocity against their citizens.
This particular bombing, which killed a lot of innocent civilians, was kind of a touchstone for the U.S. government. They now had some evidence that they could use openly.
There was certainly good information that Gaddafi was behind the Palestinians that blew up the La Belle disco.
There was enough intelligence to indicate that that bombing was not an isolated event. It really was a pattern of operations that Libya was engaging in and was absolutely going to continue into the future, and they would get worse.
This is not a case of picking on some guy to make an example of him. The man wasn't innocent at all. Gaddafi was indeed doing what the Reagan administration was saying that he was doing.
There is such a thing as evil. Today, it is not popular to talk about evil. I mean, there aren't any evil people in some people's minds, but anybody who supports terrorism is evil, and the evil's got to be dealt with.
In Washington, a decision is made. They have to punish the Libyan leader.
It was enough for the Reagan administration to go after Gaddafi. That was the fuse that lit the whole thing.
Dealing with Gaddafi was at the top of foreign policy, from the president down to the executive agencies like the CIA.
The big sea change was becoming more aggressive for the first time on terrorism.
The Reagan administration says, all right, we're going to draw a line in the sand.
They saw it as an opportunity to have a regime change there one way or the other.
The United States felt that it needed to send a signal to these state sponsors of international terrorism.
When our citizens are abused or attacked anywhere in the world on the direct orders of a hostile regime, we will respond so long as I'm in this Oval Office.
There is no question now that America will retaliate. The only issue is how. To lead the fight, Reagan turns to his hardline head of the CIA, William Casey.
Reagan was really looking to establish a much more muscular foreign policy. And he had in his team people like William Casey at the CIA.
Well, Casey obviously was a very intelligent guy. He was a risk taker, and that's different from being a gambler.
He was a very intimidating person if you were afraid of him. He was had a very short temper. He didn't suffer fools lightly.
In many respects, he was a wild man. He had really no time for the moderates, you know, the make nice people.
Casey was determined to do something about Gaddafi.
He was very hawkish, and he wanted to restore American prestige around the world.
Casey suggests a top-secret black operation in which Gaddafi will be eliminated. But getting to Gaddafi will be extremely difficult.
He was a maverick, but he was a maverick with a level of desert cunning, if you like, that made him very, very difficult to remove.
Libya is a military state. Gaddafi is protected by thousands of dedicated troops, including a personal retinue of female Amazonian bodyguards. On top of this, the CIA has barely any agents or assets in the country.
I told them we didn't have the capability or the kind of message they wanted.
Casey also has another problem. Political assassinations have been outlawed in the United States since 1974.
During Watergate, Gerald Ford, the president, issued an executive order banning assassinations by any agency, including the CIA.
Early in his presidency, Reagan had reaffirmed this commitment.
Yeah, Reagan himself had signed the presidential directive that forbade assassination.
So Casey's hands were tied.
They wanted to remove Gaddafi without contravening that directive.
A covert assassination attempt on an individual may be against the law, but overt military action against the Libyan state is regarded as a legitimate and justified response.
The U.S. response was really a military operation.
The president initiates Operation El Dorado Canyon. Instead of sending in a CIA hit squad, the U.S. will launch airstrikes on a series of military targets inside Libya.
The decision was taken to go after, quote, the command center, unquote.
Both the president and Casey know that the command center is actually Gaddafi's home.
It was a substantial bombing raid against Libya and specifically against Gaddafi, targeting his huge compound in Tripoli.
This is an assassination attempt in all but name.
Now, sitting around that table, there wasn't any winking or, eyes rolling or anything like that about what are we really up to here. Everybody knew damn well that there was a good likelihood that we could take out Gaddafi without, quote, targeting him.
To attack the residence or home of the leader is clearly a targeted assassination, just like if somebody were to try to attack the White House.
What's the hell's the difference if you're gonna kill somebody, whether you do it with a single bullet to the head or you do it with a 2,000-pound bomb? I mean, let's not have an argument about it.
For Operation El Dorado Canyon, US planes will launch raids on a series of targets in Libya's main cities, Tripoli and Benghazi. It is up to the CIA to provide the intelligence on the exact locations of the targets for the strikes.
The National Photo Interpretation Center, which belonged to the agency, provided the photography that was used during the planning for which places to attack.
The targets include military compounds, government buildings, and anti-aircraft batteries. But the key target is Gaddafi's command center, a sprawling compound in the heart of Tripoli, which includes Gaddafi's home and a Bedouin tent where he is reported to spend most of his time.
The problem was hitting Gaddafi's command headquarters, which we all knew was connected to his home, if you will, which was in a tent.
The difficulty the CIA face is timing. The bombers need to strike when they can be certain Gaddafi is in his tent. Without agents on the ground, this will be almost impossible to know.
The intelligence available as to Gaddafi's whereabouts wasn't particularly very good.
So Casey turns to Israel.
Israel is a very, very close ally, both politically and in intelligence areas. And so we work with them really as our intelligence and political brothers and sisters, really.
Agents from the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, set up a surveillance post overlooking Gaddafi's compound. They locate the tent and confirm that Gaddafi is in there. The main contingent of US F-111 bombers take off from American air bases in Britain. As the bombers cross the Mediterranean Sea, fighter planes on US aircraft carriers are scrambled to escort them into Libyan airspace. As the American bombers approach Libya, the Israeli surveillance team confirm that Gaddafi is working late into the night in his tent. Having reported this back, the Mossad agents withdraw. "40 minutes later, the first F-111 jets strike. Casey and other key CIA chiefs are assembled in their offices having a drink as they wait for news.
Casey, I was there, maybe 2 or 3 others, and listened to the information coming in on the particular attack.
Eventually, they receive confirmation that the bombers have hit the Libyan military targets. It seems that the mission is a success, although there is no official confirmation of Gaddafi's fate. Meanwhile, at the White House, the president has assembled his military advisors. An hour into the raid, 2 men arrive at the White House with a videotape in a locked briefcase. They play the tape to the president and the assembled military chiefs. It is the footage from the F-111s conducting the airstrikes. Later that evening, President Reagan takes to the airwaves.
At 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities.
The following day, a reconnaissance aircraft is sent to survey the damage.
They put up an SR-71 when they had some daylight, and it ran a mission to actually look at what had happened on the ground.
It confirms that the bombers have hit the CIA's most important target, Gaddafi's compound. It has been devastated, and Gaddafi's tent leveled. But there is still no news on the fate of the Libyan dictator himself. The following evening, news channels break the story that Reagan and Casey had dreaded.
Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Muammar Gaddafi apparently is alive, but questions still far outnumber answers, and mystery still rules 48 hours after U.S. combat jets blasted Muammar Gaddafi's Libya.
Now, in the aftermath of the U.S. attacks, Gaddafi's regime exploits the collateral damage caused by the bombings. Although later proven to be a lie, Libyan news agencies even claim that Gaddafi's adopted daughter is among the 60 dead. The grim truth for the CIA is that the mission has failed.
The results were probably not what anybody expected. They expected better results.
The goal of El Dorado Canyon was to get rid of Gaddafi, and that didn't happen.
Gaddafi was not even injured.
With the door closed on further military operations, CIA Chief Casey must now turn to other means to eliminate Gaddafi.
I don't believe the niceties of how he would be removed from power bothered the Reagan administration. They wanted him out.
Casey now focuses on a classic clandestine CIA method. The agency will foment an uprising of Libyans to overthrow Gaddafi.
In terms of getting rid of foreign leaders who pose a threat, there's always third parties that can be used to do this.
It is a strategy the CIA have employed successfully for decades.
Well, I think having regime change, using covert action as the principal instrument, has been tried a few times, okay?
From Guatemala to Chile, the CIA has covertly supported rebel groups to oust anti-American leaders, providing them with training, weapons, and high-tech support.
When you think about it from an operational perspective, is the best case scenario. The U.S. government doesn't have to get its hands dirty per se, and the third party does it. And if something goes wrong, well, they take the blame for it.
Critical to this sort of action is having the right person to lead the rebels. Casey believes that if he can find the right leader, a Libyan rebellion is the best way to be rid of Gaddafi.
Already there had been efforts about putting together a paramilitary force of Libyans to try and have a little regime change in Libya.
For 7 years, Casey had been secretly supporting Libyan opposition groups in neighboring countries, providing weapons and training. The problem for the CIA is that the Libyan opposition to Gaddafi is divided.
Libya is not a country. It's a bunch of tribes within colonial borders, and what do you do with tribes? I mean, how do you raise the Libyan tribes? I mean, this isn't Lawrence of Arabia.
Casey realizes that he needs someone from Libya who can unite the different factions.
Casey was sorting out who should lead it, which Libyan should lead it or could lead it.
The man Casey is looking for needs to be someone who knows Gaddafi well.
The idea was to get as close to Gaddafi as we possibly could, especially his generals and others would certainly be the target of the CIA.
Eventually, Casey believes he has found the man he wants to lead the Libyan rebellion, Colonel Kahlifa Haftar. At first glance, Haftar seems an unlikely choice of leader for an anti-Gaddafi force. He's one of Libya's leading military commanders.
Kahlifa Haftar was a professional soldier. His relationship with Gaddafi went right back to the day of the revolution when they overthrew King Idris.
He is a skilled tactician who commands loyalty from his troops. For much of his career, he has been involved in fighting with Libya's southern neighbor, Chad.
He was very much involved in Gaddafi's occupation of a big chunk of Chad, which Gaddafi always had designs on.
Despite leading a fearsome campaign, in 1986, just at the point when Casey was looking for someone to lead the rebellion, the Chadian army regrouped and overwhelmed Haftar's forces.
Several hundred Libyan troops, including Haftar, were captured and imprisoned.
Back in Libya, Gaddafi is furious. His army has been decimated and tens of millions of dollars in equipment lost. He blames Haftar for the failure and leaves his former friend to rot in a Chadian prison cell.
And at that point, Gaddafi washed his hands of the whole operation as if there weren't any Libyan POWs anywhere. And he didn't know anything about the Libyan troops that had been in Chad and had disappeared.
For the CIA, Haftar's imprisonment is a major recruitment opportunity. If they can convince the colonel to turn against Gaddafi, he will be the perfect man to lead the rebel forces. So the CIA activate one of their major assets, the president of Chad himself, Hissène Habré. The CIA have provided substantial support to Habré in his wars against Gaddafi. Now Casey decides to call in the favor. After 7 months languishing in a Chadian prison, Haftar is visited by President Habré.
And it was reported that Habré at one point went to see him.
It is believed that the Chadian president makes Haftar an offer on behalf of the CIA.
Habré offered him the option of turning against Gaddafi, of joining a rebellion, of forming an army in exile, and then marching on Libya.
Having been abandoned by Gaddafi, Haftar agrees to side with the CIA.
Haftar and many like him decided that they would turn against Gaddafi, and they formed the Libyan National Army.
In a classic CIA maneuver, a small force is put together. At its core, the 300 men captured with Haftar. The CIA will arm and train the force with the aim of using them to instigate an uprising in Libya.
The force was certainly trained by CIA people, and the weapons, of course, came from us, and the money and the vehicles and so on and so forth.
The idea was a force would be formed that would be big enough and strong enough to go back and at least begin to sow the seeds of a rebellion inside Libya.
And the United States begins to train Libyan resistance fighters to go back into Libya and overthrow Gaddafi.
Two years on from the US military attacks on Libya, Gaddafi remains strangely quiet. The US believes that Operation El Dorado Canyon, while failing to kill him, has at the very least deterred him from further terrorist activity. But Gaddafi is secretly planning another devastating act of terrorism, which occurs in late 1988. Pan Am Flight 103 prepares to depart for New York from London Heathrow. Among the baggage is the suitcase of a Libyan agent who never boards the flight.
Clearly, Gaddafi didn't give up.
The most dramatic piece of evidence that Gaddafi didn't learn the lesson of El Dorado Canyon is the fate of Pan Am 103.
Hundreds of passengers board, most of them Americans, heading home for Christmas. As they take off, the passengers are unaware that they are in imminent danger. 38 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft passes over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, a timed device in the suitcase goes off. All 243 passengers are killed, as are 11 people on the ground. Gaddafi has struck again.
We charge that 2 Libyan officials, acting as operatives of the Libyan intelligence service, along with other co-conspirators, planted and detonated the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103.
At the time, it is the worst terrorist attack ever inflicted on American civilians. After Lockerbie, the whole world responds. Not with bombs, but sanctions. Gaddafi is frozen out. He becomes an international pariah. The CIA, however, remained determined to go even further.
Gaddafi has managed, through his own actions, to put himself at the top of the hit list for the United States.
In Washington, they are pinning their hopes on a revolution to overthrow the man they call the Mad Dog, led by Kahlifa Haftar and his CIA-trained force of rebels. Then events in Africa ruin the CIA's plans. In 1990, the pro-American government of Libya's neighbor Chad is forced out and replaced by a new president who is hostile to the US-backed Libyan rebels.
So suddenly you have these several hundred Libyan soldiers sitting in Chad, getting ready to take action against Gaddafi, but the new president of Chad doesn't want them there.
Worse still, the coup had been supported by Gaddafi, and now the Libyan leader wants his payback. Gaddafi knows all about Haftar's army, and he demands that they be handed over to him. Gaddafi wants Haftar dead. The CIA is forced to come to Haftar's rescue.
The Americans come in with transport planes into N'Djamena and remove them. And then this odyssey starts that goes on for the best part of a year.
America funds the evacuation of Haftar's force from Chad in what becomes known as Operation Magic Carpet. The 300-strong group are transported first to Nigeria, then on to Zaire, and then finally to Kenya. But the CIA-backed rebels discover that they are unwelcome in country after country.
Ultimately, the Americans are left with no choice but to bring them back to the US.
The man the CIA want to lead a Libyan rebellion settles in suburban Virginia, only a short drive from CIA HQ in Langley. His men are settled across the country in 25 different states.
Haftar himself, after this long odyssey across Africa, settles in Falls Church, Virginia. He lived in a very nice house, he had a lot of kids, but he still always harbored this idea of returning to Libya.
For the CIA, it is a huge disappointment. But they retain the hope that at some point Haftar's force will be able to regroup and return to Libya. As the years pass, Gaddafi is contained by relentless sanctions and continued international political pressure. Then in September 2001, the kind of threat that Gaddafi poses to the world is placed in a very different context. On September the 11th, 2001, 19 Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners and crashed them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It is the dawn of a new age of terror. A much more frightening force than Gaddafi emerges from the shadows: al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not state-sponsored. It marks a revolutionary shift in terrorism. So America moves to all-out war.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
With the stakes dramatically raised, Gaddafi switches sides.
Well, Gaddafi's change, or supposed change, didn't surprise me, frankly, because he is a total opportunist.
Gaddafi did a remarkable turnaround. Publicly, he came out against terrorism and acts of terrorism, went out of his way to build a relationship with the U.S. government.
Few believe Gaddafi is really a changed man. He is simply desperate to save his own skin.
Gaddafi is afraid of the George W. Bush administration. The administration is talking about weapons of mass destruction. It's focused on Saddam Hussein, but Gaddafi didn't want to take a chance that he would be enemy number one again.
He realized that his plans against the West were going nowhere, and essentially he could lose his government and even his own life.
The one-time mad dog of the Middle East quickly reinvents himself as a valuable ally in President Bush's war on terror.
He makes a strategic calculation and does a deal with the United States. The effect of that is that he becomes a poster child for unilateral disarmament.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
It is an almost inconceivable change in relations between Gaddafi and the West. Gaddafi, the former international pariah, is visited by a stream of Western leaders. Sanctions are dropped, oil flows out, and money flows in. With the war against al-Qaeda America's primary objective, and by appearing to have transformed himself into an ally, Gaddafi has succeeded in removing himself from the CIA's hit list.
Gaddafi was never worthy of an American embrace as a human being. Gaddafi's record is horrendous, and that's not a record that you could ever expunge. But American interests in the region changed over time.
In 2009, Gaddafi is even invited to speak at the United Nations in New York. It seems his rehabilitation into the international community is complete. However, in a 90-minute rant to the United Nations, Gaddafi calls the Security Council terrorists, says George Bush should be charged with war crimes, and demands $7 trillion in compensation for colonialism. To the CIA, it is clear that Gaddafi remains as unstable and dangerous as he ever was. Two years later, a new opportunity for the CIA to deal with Gaddafi arises: the Arab Spring. Inspired by revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, popular protests break out across Libya.
In February of 2011, as the Arab Spring takes off, it finally percolates through, if you like, to Libya, and a protest in Benghazi gets out of hand and quickly becomes an uprising.
Gaddafi sends his troops against the protesters, believing no one will interfere.
Gaddafi probably in 2011 it concluded that he was going to be okay, that the Americans would not move against him.
But he was wrong. As the Libyan protests grow into an armed opposition, the US joins its NATO allies in providing air cover to protect Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's troops.
Today, I authorize the armed forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya. That action has now begun.
NATO's mission in March 2011 was essentially to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi. It was clear that there was going to be an absolute bloodbath as Gaddafi's forces moved east, and the Benghazi uprising was essentially no more than that. It was just a chaotic popular rebellion that could have easily been suppressed by Gaddafi's forces. But NATO's mission then began to creep. It began to involve hitting anything that Gaddafi had that moved, not just his air force, but anything on the ground that moved.
Under the protection of NATO air support, the Libyan rebel forces are growing in strength and now control much of eastern Libya. But for the CIA, the rebels pose a problem. Some of them are potentially a threat to American interests.
At that point, the Transitional National Council, which is trying to get its act together, trying to form a united front against Gaddafi, is all over the place. There are factions, there are rivalries within the military apparatus.
The worry is that Islamic militants like al-Qaeda will hijack the revolution. The CIA want to see a military commander they can trust, Colonel Kahlifa Haftar, in charge of the rebels.
The Americans want Haftar to go back to Libya, to join the fight, to professionalize the rebellion.
For Haftar, once a senior leader in the Libyan army, taking on Gaddafi is personal.
Haftar, in any case, would have gone. He had never forgiven Gaddafi for the way he deserted him in Chad some 20 years previously, and he wanted to get his own back. He was determined to be part of that rebellion.
One month into the rebellion, Haftar arrives in Benghazi with a handful of his officers to cheering crowds. Within weeks, he is installed as the commander of the rebel forces.
The CIA needed trainers to help this ragtag army that was forming. That's what Kahlifa Haftar was there to do, to help organize an otherwise completely disorganized rebellion.
With their preferred man in charge, the CIA is better placed to steer the Libyan rebellion. Haftar is in command of troops on the ground. Now America helps lead the fight from the skies. NATO becomes, in effect, the rebel air force.
There were about 17,000 NATO missions over that summer period. And of course, that needed a great deal of coordination from the ground.
CIA agents from its elite Special Activities Division operate covertly in Libya. They identify targets and call in airstrikes to support the rebels in their war against Gaddafi.
There were CIA operatives there to help the rebels communicate with each other, to plan better, to be able to sustain their advances.
Thanks to this CIA support, within a few short months, the rebel forces take control of key Libyan cities. After 6 months of heavy fighting, the Libyan capital falls to the rebels, and Gaddafi goes into hiding.
Gaddafi disappeared, as did his sons. Nobody knew where the Gaddafis had gone.
The CIA now begins hunting for the Libyan dictator. Drawing on every available source, the agency eventually discovers that Gaddafi has retreated to the northern city of Sirte.
Gaddafi had gone to Sirte with an ever-diminishing band of supporters, but gradually the rebels' noose around Sirte from east and west was tightening.
Gaddafi is surrounded. In the early hours, a convoy of vehicles attempts to break out of Sirte.
In the skies above, NATO assets had been patrolling for a long time, and they were able instantly to see this unusual activity.
The CIA scrambles a reconnaissance drone and scan the airwaves for communications, desperate to find out if Gaddafi is in the convoy. Agents then receive vital intelligence. A call from a satellite phone is intercepted from the convoy. The CIA confirms it is Gaddafi.
Gaddafi makes a break for it in a convoy of dozens of vehicles trying to get out of Sirte.
The CIA now alerts United States Air Force drone commanders in Las Vegas who launch a deadly Predator drone from a base in Sicily to intercept the convoy.
In no time at all, Hellfire missiles are raining down.
The drone's missiles slam into the convoy, while NATO fighter jets bomb from overhead. As rebel forces advance on the ground, Gaddafi is forced to make a break for it on foot.
Gaddafi is discovered, dragged out, beaten, and thrown across the hood of a car.
The rebels turn into a baying mob. They unleash a murderous revenge upon Gaddafi for 4 decades of oppression. His body, beaten and bloodied, is paraded as a trophy.
That was the very demeaning end to a man who had ruled Libya for 40 years, who had regarded himself as a prophet, really, for the Arab people.
For the CIA, Gaddafi's death is a triumph. They had always had him as a target, and although it had taken 30 years, eventually their plan has worked.
Haftar and his lieutenants were trained by the CIA to remove Gaddafi. The fact is that instead of helping to remove Gaddafi in the late 1980s, they came back 20 years later and finished the job.
The CIA has been instrumental in removing Gaddafi in what, until now, the world believed was an entirely Libyan uprising.